Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket set to carry 40 satellites into orbit for OneWeb, the internet constellation company. You're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center, where SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is vertical at this hour, an hour and 12 minutes remaining until this evening's launch opportunity at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is 22:27 UTC. As I mentioned, the payload for tonight's mission consists of 40 satellites for OneWeb. OneWeb is one of several companies that is either developing or deploying mega constellations of satellites to provide low latency broadband service around the world. One of the other companies doing such work is SpaceX. These two companies are often considered rivals in this market. However, they do have differences. OneWeb is focused at a different segment of the broadband market than SpaceX, so they're not peer-to-peer competitors in that sense. But this is going to be SpaceX's first launch for OneWeb. OneWeb has launched 14 missions to date. 13 of those were on Russian Soyuz rockets. And then most recently, OneWeb launched satellites on an Indian GSLV Mark III rocket back in October. OneWeb has turned to other launch providers such as India and SpaceX to launch their remaining satellites after Russia has refused to carry out its remaining contract obligations to OneWeb in the wake of the Russian military's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions levied on Russia in the aftermath of that event earlier this year. Russia refused to launch satellites that were already delivered to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and just within weeks later, OneWeb signed contracts with SpaceX and New Space India Limited to continue deploying their constellation. And what you're seeing now out at Pad 39A is the fruit of that contract, with a Falcon 9 rocket loaded with 40 satellites ready for launch this afternoon at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center. Weather conditions here in Florida this evening are near ideal for launch, with mostly clear skies, light winds. There's a 90% probability of favorable weather for launch this evening. Everything right now, as far as we know, is looking good for liftoff at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time. We're seeing some vapors venting from some of the ground support equipment out at Pad 39A now, indicating that some of the preparations to begin loading propellants into the rocket are now getting underway. That propellant loading process will begin at T-minus 35 minutes. About 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen will be loaded into the Falcon 9 rocket in the final 35 minutes before liftoff. We're going to have live coverage throughout the countdown and flight of the Falcon 9 rocket this evening. The booster stage of the Falcon 9 will be returning to a landing at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, targeting a touchdown on Landing Zone 1, about 9 miles or 15 kilometers south of Pad 39A. So this will be a return to launch site, or RTLS, mission for SpaceX right at sunset. So it could be a spectacular launch tonight and a spectacular landing tonight, accompanied by sonic booms that we expect to hear across the Space Coast when that booster makes its descent back toward the Cape. This will be SpaceX's 55th launch of the year. The company right now is on track for launching as many as 60 missions in the calendar year 2022. This is number 55. Now 1 hour, 7 minutes, and 45 seconds until this evening's launch opportunity at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time. SpaceX's countdown is passing the T-minus 1 hour mark. Again, the next major event in the countdown this afternoon will be the start of propellant loading. That is due to begin in 25 minutes at the T-minus 35-minute point. A few minutes before that milestone, SpaceX's launch team in the firing room here at Kennedy Space Center will be polled for their go or no-go to proceed into the propellant loading sequence. Again, the weather conditions here in Florida look very favorable for launch today. Now, inside of 15 minutes until this evening's launch of a Falcon 9, the payload for tonight's mission consists of 40 satellites. Here's a picture of those satellites stacked on their dispenser. This is a specially designed mechanism that actually holds these 40 satellites sort of like a tiered wedding cake almost, with 5 different tiers of satellites on this metallic dispenser that SpaceX has developed for OneWeb. These satellites were built by OneWeb Satellites, which is a joint venture between Airbus and OneWeb. Each of these spacecraft weighs about 325 pounds, 147.5 kilograms. That's the fully fueled mass of each satellite with xenon fuel on board. With 40 satellites, that totals about 13,000 pounds of mass, of payload mass heading to orbit on tonight's mission. These satellites will be deployed in an orbit about 373 miles above the Earth, and then they will use their own propulsion systems to maneuver up to the operating altitude for the OneWeb constellation at 745 miles or 1,200 kilometers. And with these 40 satellites, OneWeb will have 504 satellites in orbit of its planned first-generation constellation of nearly 650. These satellites have Ku-band user beams to provide low-latency broadband service to clients like schools, homes, businesses, rural communities, ships, aircraft, etc. It's a similar type of service that SpaceX's Starlink network provides. However, the Starlink network is primarily geared toward consumer-grade broadband to individual homes and businesses, whereas the OneWeb constellation is tailored to serve telecommunications companies, entire rural communities, campuses, hospitals, schools, and other types of clients that don't have access to terrestrial fiber for their internet connectivity. We interviewed the OneWeb Chief Technology Officer, Massimiliano Ladovaz, earlier this morning to talk about the OneWeb launch and what to expect. Massimiliano Ladovaz, the Chief Technology Officer for OneWeb, and he's at Cape Canaveral for the launch of 40 satellites on a Falcon 9 rocket. First of all, how are launch preparations going for tonight?
So far, so good. We are really anxious to get to the launch. Everything is going well as planned, and yeah, I'm gonna go to the control center in few minutes just after this interview.
Okay. What's it been like to work with SpaceX? You've have experience with Arianespace and the Russian launch teams, and you now have experience with ISRO and NSIL for the GSLV Mark III. What's it been like comparatively working with SpaceX?
It's been great. Honestly, it's incredible what SpaceX can achieve in such a short amount of time. It's another dimension compared to other launch vehicle providers. I mean, obviously they're all very good, but really it's a scale, it's space, it's tempo, very professional. I'm really enjoying. I mean, I had past experience with previous companies, but really, and you can see that they're improving every time. They're improving at every launch. Really great.
I know OneWeb and Starlink, while they share some similarities, they're kind of geared toward different markets. But it did surprise a lot of people when OneWeb booked these launches with SpaceX. Is this like a team of rivals? How would you describe it? Has there been any friction at all in this relationship?
Absolutely no friction. Extremely professional. I mean, the launch people are really focused on getting the job done. And then, we have very good relation with SpaceX in general. I mean, this is not the time to get into wars. I mean, again, we're not competing for the same in the same markets, and this is about really cooperation.
What's it like launching OneWeb satellites so close to the factory? I can imagine it's some benefits logistically. You don't have to hire an Antonov to carry it halfway around the world. But how much does it simplify things for the team? And also for the team at the factory, are they excited to see their satellites launch in person?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so much easier It's the launch preps and even in getting ready for launch. It's much easier. You can start shipping one satellite at a time instead of having to make sure you have all the satellites ready in one shot. You can integrate them basically day by day if it needs be, and it's definitely easier. And people can sleep in their beds at night, and obviously it's a great for the team itself. And yeah, I mean, I was at the factory yesterday, and not only the OneWeb but the OneWeb satellite team are extremely excited by the fact that finally you can see their satellite launching on from up just watching it outside outside in the garden.
So there are 40 satellites on this mission. That's more than you have launched with Soyuz and with the GSLV Mark III. What allowed you to increase the number of satellites on the Falcon 9 rocket?
I mean, the rock is more performing, and then really we SpaceX we worked on a different dispenser. That was the key. I mean, on Israel we were really trying to reuse the original dispenser. Here, with SpaceX we decided a different approach and design from scratch a new dispenser. Actually, that's quite an accomplishment in few months. I mean, kudos to the SpaceX team.
The 40 satellites, is it is it basically limited to the volume that's inside the fairing that limits you to 40 satellites for SpaceX launch?
I think I mean it's really the limit factor was really performance of the rocket and keeping some margin. We could have done probably more, but I think we were comfortable with this number of satellites.
The picture I've seen of the stack of OneWeb satellites that are launching tonight looks kind of similar to the dispenser that you used on Soyuz and ISRO, the RUAG Beyond Gravity dispenser. How is it different from that, other than just accommodating more satellites? Is it kind of a similar design though?
Oh, it's completely. Actually it's a completely different design. I mean, again, it's a different way of doing things. Look, it's incredible if you think about it. Designing from scratch a dispenser in few months. When SpaceX came back to us and proposed that idea, where to be honest, we were a little bit um, concerned. But they explained that to us, and we accepted, and we moved away, and we moved along with the idea. And it is a different design. Obviously, the separation system is similar, but really the dispenser itself is a completely different design. I mean, this is a metallic dispenser. The RAG is carbon. Uh, that's why how they could do it in few months.
And if I'm reading the SpaceX launch timeline correctly, you kind of deploy the satellites in 3 bunches at 13 or 14 at a time instead of 4 at a time. Is that am I reading that correctly, first of all? And how do you ensure enough physical spacing between the satellites when you deploy so many at once?
Look, yes, the separation system separation sequence is going to be different from the previous launches, but I mean, we have done obviously all the analysis that to demonstrate that we are fine. Obviously, this is what the main part of the integration work with SpaceX, making sure that this part is fine, and we are comfortable with. Obviously, SpaceX has also great experience on this matter as well. We're not talking about someone who has no experience about it. They do that nearly every I don't know every week, every month. I lost track how many launches that they do with Starlink.
Yeah, I think there is quite a few launches. I know this is like the 54th, I believe, SpaceX launch this year. It's a
Yeah,
crazy pace.
it's crazy. But
Um,
yeah, the launch sequence is gonna be different, and hopefully, I mean, we'll get I mean, contact with the satellite pretty fast. I mean, the pacing item is when the satellite will cross our TTNC in around the poles.
and they are separating in 3 groups, though, if I'm reading the timeline correctly. 3
Right.
bunches of 13 or
Right.
14. Okay. And what's the target orbit, injection orbit for this mission? I know Soyuz was like 450. What's SpaceX
It's
delivering you to?
we agreed a 600-kilometer orbit, um, and then I mean it's not very similar to the part from the altitude, very similar to the other launchers.
I'm sorry, I missed that. How many
It's
kilometers?
600.
600 kilometers. Okay. And you're going to be surpassing 500 satellites launched with this mission. That's kind of a milestone for you guys.
Correct.
Yeah. How are things going with the satellites in orbit? Are they all functioning, or have you had any issues?
No, we had I mean we had a few issues, but in terms I mean I think it's public. I mean our failure rate, luckily, it's very low. I think it's probably less than 1%, and we want to keep it that way, even lower than that. But if not the satellite, I mean obviously apart of very few issues that are public, the satellite are performing very well. Actually, even beyond spec, and performance are really good. Unfortunately, I mean, all those delays we had with Ukraine crisis, I mean, would have slowed us down. That's why I'm so excited about this launch today.
And
And
go
it's
ahead.
very important. One item I would like to add is this launch is very important for us because it's going to allow us to increase significantly the coverage of our service. Basically, with this launch, we'll be able to cover up to 25 degrees north and south, and this means I mean the entire United States and up, and a large majority, I mean, half of Australia down, and South America.
I did want to ask you about what this launch brings to your consumers and to your customers. Are you currently providing services like on an interim basis?
Well, we are in service. We have declared what we call the Commercial Services Introduction One (CSI One) quite several months ago, and we are providing service in Alaska, in Canada, in northern Europe.
And this will bring a lot more people under your network.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important, and we're so excited about it. It's really a really important launch for us.
And what's the status of production for your remaining Gen 1 satellites? Are those all done in storage, or some final things going on in the factory there?
Well, we are done. We have just, I mean, you have to put them in storage and then take them out of storage as usual. Those are but we are done. We are done.
And just wanted to ask for an update on another. You have satellites still in Baikonur. Are you still planning or hoping to recover those, or are you able to move forward without using those satellites in your network?
Well, I mean, definitely we are moving forward without them. On if we will be able to recover them, I can't answer. I mean, honestly I can't answer. It's probably beyond us.
Impact your network plans at all, or are those going to be like effectively spares or something?
It's zero. We already produced additional satellite to compensate, and have spares. Right, our constellation has quite a few spares that most of them will be launched this year. Some will be ground spares.
And I guess last thing, can you kind of look forward to your remaining Gen 1 launches? When do we expect to see the remaining 3 after this one, I think?
Correct. And there is also a ride share with Iridium as well, and then yeah, I mean I don't want to jinx it, but really hope that we can get this one plus and the other 3 by Q1, beginning of Q2 this year.
And just to make sure I understand, so you have one more remaining with NSIL from India and 2 dedicated SpaceX launches
Correct.
and the rideshare.
Correct.
Understand.
Correct.
Okay, Massey. Well, thank you for your time, and good luck with the launch tonight. Hope everything
Thank you very
cooperates.
much. Thank you for your question and your time. Thank you.
LD and the approve during the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control abort the launch auto signals immediately and proceed into launch abort. At T minus 10 seconds, launch control is hands off, rely on automated abort criteria.
That was an interview with Massimiliano Ladovez, the Chief Technology Officer of OneWeb. We spoke with him this morning via Zoom. He's here at Cape Canaveral supporting tonight's launch. And once the interview was complete, we brought up some audio from SpaceX Launch Control. The teams just confirmed that they are go for the start of propellant loading, and that propellant loading did begin about 1 minute ago at T-minus 35 minutes, so everything is on schedule for liftoff at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time, or 22:27 UTC. If you're just joining us, you're looking live at Launch Complex 39A here at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the 229-foot tall Falcon 9 rocket is now being loaded with propellants for launch at 5:27 p.m. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger following for our coverage. We want to bring this launch, which is scheduled right at the moment of sunset, to as many people as possible here at Kennedy Space Center and wherever you're watching around the world. T-minus 27 minutes, 30 seconds and counting, while SpaceX continues loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. Here's a look at what this rocket will be carrying into orbit tonight. 40 OneWeb satellites are stowed inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 for liftoff at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time. On the left side of this frame, you can see an image from OneWeb's factory, which is actually located just outside the gates of Kennedy Space Center, a few miles from the launch pad. We heard earlier from OneWeb's Chief Technology Officer, Massimiliano Ladovez, that the teams at the factory there are excited to see one of their satellite missions launch with their own eyes instead of having to watch one of their launches online from launch sites in Russia or Kazakhstan or India. These satellites are built by a joint venture between Airbus and OneWeb. The joint venture is called OneWeb Satellites. On the upper right here in this slide is an artist concept of the OneWeb network. The first generation OneWeb network will have nearly 650 satellites, including spares, in orbit, flying in 12 different orbital planes in polar orbit. So tonight's mission from Pad 39A will target a polar orbit heading to the south from Kennedy Space Center. And on the lower right, you can see what these satellites look like with their antennas deployed and their solar panels deployed. After releasing from the top of the Falcon 9, the satellites will use their own electric propulsion system to climb from their injection altitude of about 373 miles to an operating altitude of 745 miles or 1,200 kilometers. That process will take a few months before these satellites are ready to join the operational network, which is already providing service over northern latitudes like Alaska, Canada, and Europe. This mission will bring OneWeb's coverage down to 25 degrees north and south latitude, so the entire continental United States, for example, will be reachable with the OneWeb network after these satellites are launched and in service. Now, inside of 25 minutes until launch, here's a view of the Kennedy Space Center press site. You can see some of the news media representatives, reporters, photographers gathering on the press site lawn about 3 miles from the launch pad. You see the American flag waving as well as the Artemis program flag at the flagpole here at the press site to note that the Artemis 1 mission remains in space. This is the lunar test flight that's being flown by NASA to check out the Space Launch System, which performed flawlessly in its inaugural launch back on November the 16th, as well as the Orion capsule in deep space. And earlier today, we saw the mobile launcher for the Space Launch System roll off of Pad 39B following the SLS test launch last month, and is now outside the door of High Bay 3 of the Vehicle Assembly Building. It'll roll into the High Bay tomorrow, where technicians will begin making repairs to the structure that did sustain some minor damage during the launch of the SLS moon rocket back on November the 16th. And then sometime we expect early next year, the mobile launcher will move from the high bay to a park site just outside of the Vehicle Assembly Building, where teams will install a crew escape system on the mobile launch tower. And that's in preparation for Artemis 2, scheduled for the second half, currently scheduled for the second half of 2024 on the next Space Launch System and Orion flight. That'll be the first to carry astronauts into deep space on a loop around the far side of the moon, and then they'll be coming back to Earth on that Artemis 2 test flight. Back live with a look at Launch Complex 39A, where SpaceX continues counting down for launch this evening at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time, with 40 OneWeb Internet satellites on this mission. You can see it's approaching golden hour here on Florida's Space Coast. The launch is scheduled right at sunset, maybe about a minute or so after the official time of sunset here at Kennedy Space Center. And with the landing expected about 8 minutes after liftoff, this should be a spectacular flight this evening. We could have or should have views of the Falcon 9 booster as it's making its return to the Cape for landing, as well as the upper stage as it powers into orbit, heading to the south from Kennedy Space Center into polar orbit. It'll be flying parallel to the east coast of the United States. One of the next big milestones will be the completion of kerosene fueling on the second stage. That's coming up in less than 2 minutes' time. And then shortly after that, we expect to see the big vent from the strongback out at Pad 39A as chill down or thermal conditioning gets underway for liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
Now inside of 20 minutes until liftoff, there is the big vent that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. This is a plume of gaseous oxygen that's being vented out of the strongback. That's the structure just next to the Falcon 9 on the pad. And this coincides with the start of chill down or thermal conditioning of the liquid oxygen transfer lines that flow the super cold cryogenic oxidizer up the strongback from the ground storage tanks into the upper stage at the upper part of the Falcon 9. The propellants on the first stage are being loaded from the bottom of the rocket, so they don't need to go up that strongback structure. And we heard confirmation from launch control also about a minute ago that kerosene fueling on the upper stage is complete. Here's a look at the countdown timeline for the next steps in this evening's countdown. We've already passed a few of these milestones. Propellant loading began at T-minus 35 minutes, right on time. The next milestone will be at T-minus 16 minutes, so very soon now we should hear confirmation of liquid oxygen loading getting underway on the second stage. At T-minus 7 minutes, thermal conditioning or chill down of the Merlin engines, the 9 main engines on the first stage, will begin. At T-minus 5.5 minutes or 6 minutes, the kerosene loading on the first stage should be complete. At 4.5 minutes, the strong back will begin retracting from the vehicle to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. At T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be terminated, and then the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown at T-minus 60 seconds. Inside that final 60 seconds, the propellant tanks will be pressurized, and then the engine start command will be at T-minus 3 seconds. T-minus 15 minutes, 9 seconds. As you can see, the landscape is becoming golden as the sunset approaches. About 15 minutes now from sunset, and also 15 minutes from launch. Propellants continue flowing into the Falcon 9. Just a status check on where things stand with propellant loading. Kerosene and liquid oxygen loading continue on the first stage. Kerosene fueling on the upper stage is complete. And liquid oxygen loading on stage 2 should now be underway, although we did not hear that call from the launch control audio loop that we're receiving from SpaceX as we normally do. But right now there's no other indication that there's anything amiss in the countdown. We may have just not heard that call, which was expected at about 16 minutes before launch. T-minus 13 minutes and counting until the launch of OneWeb's flight number 15 on a Falcon 9 rocket. This will be the first SpaceX launch for OneWeb, the first of 4 Falcon 9 launches that OneWeb has booked with SpaceX. 3 of those, including tonight's, are dedicated missions. Another one will be a rideshare with Iridium satellites next year. And OneWeb expects to complete its first generation constellation sometime around the end of the first quarter or early in the second quarter of 2023. This is a few months later than they had hoped, after the suspension of launches on Russia's Soyuz rocket. If those missions on the Soyuz had proceeded, there's about a half dozen of them that were remaining. The network would have been complete by now. At least all the satellites would have been launched and getting close to entering service. But OneWeb had to stand down for about 7 months before resuming launches on an Indian GSLV rocket back in October. And now they're launching with SpaceX tonight from Kennedy Space Center. Less than 12 minutes to go. Here's a look at the expected launch profile or ground track after liftoff at 5:27 p.m. This will be a polar orbit launch, so it'll be using the southern launch corridor out of the Cape. We've labeled here Launch Complex 39A, and the red line is the approximate ground track for this mission, targeting an inclination of 87 degrees to the equator and an altitude of 373 miles or 600 kilometers at the time of injection and satellite separation. As you can see, the launch ground track will initially take the rocket to the south-southeast from pad 39A, and then it will use its thrust. It'll be vectoring the thrust from its second stage to steer more on a southerly course, flying just off the coast of West Palm Beach and then out over the Straits of Florida, Cuba, the Caribbean Sea, and then finally over South America and Antarctica. There's no location for the drone ship labeled on this map because the booster will be returning to landing zone 1 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station about 8 minutes after liftoff. So we expect to have a launch here in Florida at 5:27 p.m. Less than 8 minutes later, a landing of the first stage booster is expected down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We just saw a Coast Guard helicopter fly over the Kennedy Space Center area. This is part of the customary pre-launch security sweep that the Coast Guard, the Space Force, and the Navy do around the spaceport to ensure that boats, aircraft, and personnel are all a safe distance away from the rocket and away from the expected ground track as it heads out over the Atlantic Ocean toward the south for tonight's flight to orbit. Now 7.5 minutes remaining until launch. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of thermal conditioning or chill down of the Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage. That's coming up at T-minus 7 minutes. Really beautiful views of the Falcon 9 on the pad 7 minutes from launch as the sun is setting here on Florida's Space Coast.
Spacecraft is on internal power.
Stage 1, RP1 load complete.
We heard a call a few moments ago that the OneWeb satellites are configured for launch. They've been switched to internal power in preparation for liftoff in 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Once deployed off the top of the Falcon 9, they will unfurl their solar panels and begin recharging their batteries. But until then, they will be using their own internal battery power. They've now been disconnected from the ground power supply. 5 minutes until launch. At this time, the kerosene tank on the first stage should be full. Liquid oxygen loading continues. We're seeing that frost and vapor
Tanks pressing for strong back retract.
building up around the first stage booster. And the next step, as you just heard from SpaceX Launch Control, will be the retraction of the strong back to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. It'll just slightly recline from the Falcon 9 in the next few moments. So that'll begin with the opening of clamps at the top of the strong back. Might be able to get a shot of that zoomed in here from our camera position. And then we'll see that strong back on the
Starting
right side
strong back retract.
of the rocket slightly retract. And we just heard the confirmation that the strong back retract is getting underway. But this time, 46,000 gallons of kerosene are on board the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen loading will be terminated at T-minus 2 minutes.
Stage 1, LOX load complete.
We've seen the strong back now retracting from the Falcon 9. 2.5 minutes to go. The next major milestone will be the start of or the termination of liquid oxygen loading. The booster flying tonight is booster 1069, launching for the 4th time. It's had 3 flights to its credit so far, most recently on October the 15th with the Hotbird 13F mission for Eutelsat. 4th flight going to space tonight, landing at landing
Stage 2,
zone
lock
1,
flow complete.
targeted for 8 minutes after liftoff. Liquid oxygen loading has been completed on the Falcon 9. Everything looking good for launch in a little more than 90 seconds from pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. We're seeing some water being dumped from the water tower out at
Launch
pad
gas closeouts.
39A. This is part of the preparation for the sound suppression water system to be activated in the final seconds of the countdown. At T-minus 1 minute, control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground launch sequencer computer to an onboard computer aboard the Falcon 9 itself, which will govern the final steps before launch.
Falcon 9 is to start it.
Falcon 9 is now controlling the countdown, the onboard computer in control of the final functions and checks before liftoff. Propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. Vent valves are now
LD,
closed.
go for launch.
You can see the vent has been terminated with the vent valve closed. Launch director has given his final go for launch. T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 10 seconds. T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine start and liftoff. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, carrying 40 internet satellites into orbit for OneWeb. Beautiful launch at sunset here from Kennedy Space Center. We hope you enjoyed the sounds of 9 Merlin 1D engines doing their work, boosting the Falcon 9 rocket into the stratosphere this evening, heading to orbit with 40 OneWeb satellites. About 15 seconds now remaining in this first stage burn. We'll see main engine cutoff, followed by booster separation, ignition of the second stage engine, and the start of the boost back burn for the first stage to begin its return course to Cape Canaveral for landing. We have main engine cutoff. Stage separation has been confirmed, and there we see the startup of the Merlin vacuum engine producing 200,000 pounds of thrust. And there's the startup of the boost back burn on the first stage, heading back toward the Cape for landing in about 5 minutes from now.
Stage 1 boost back shutdown.
Bearing separation confirmed. Both vehicles are following nominal trajectories.
We're continuing to see views of the first stage booster making its return to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We did see a good payload fairing jettison on the second stage. We're going to cut for a moment to SpaceX's feed. We're showing a split screen now from SpaceX cameras. On the left is a tracking camera looking at the first stage booster firing cold gas thrusters to make its way back toward the Cape. There's an onboard view from the first stage looking down toward Earth. The cold gas thrusters maintaining the pointing or attitude of the first stage to make it sure it's properly pointed in the right direction for the descent back into the atmosphere. You see the grid fins have been deployed there. On the right of this view is the Merlin vacuum engine glowing red hot 5 minutes into the launch. That red hot color in the engine bell is normal. That engine is powering 40 OneWeb satellites, 13,000 pounds of satellite payload with these 40 satellites into polar orbit this evening from Kennedy Space Center. This is actually the first launch into polar orbit from Pad 39A from Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX has performed polar orbit launches to the south from Pad 40 over the last couple of years. This is their first polar launch from 39A. And the geometry here at Kennedy Space Center is a bit interesting. The rocket went very high in the sky. You can definitely notice it's heading to the south, a very different type of launch azimuth from Pad 39A than we're used to. Now 2 minutes until the landing of the first stage booster.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
There's the entry burn now underway, and entry burn is complete. Everything looking good for landing about 1 minute 15 seconds from now. Second stage continues to fire into orbit.
FTS is safe.
One minute until touchdown. Falcon 9 making its supersonic descent toward landing zone 1.
Stage 2, FTS is safe.
Stage 1 landing burn.
We've cut over to SpaceX's feed after the rocket went behind the trees
Stage 1
here.
landing leg deploy.
SpaceX's feed does come with a few seconds of latency. Everything looked good with the landing burn after it
Stage
lit
1
to
landing
slow down.
confirmed.
Stage 2 is in terminal guidance.
We've heard double sonic booms here at Kennedy Space Center, and there is the first stage on landing zone 1 after a successful flight to space this evening at sunset. Launch from Kennedy Space Center occurred at 5:27 p.m. Less than 8 minutes later, the first stage has arrived back on planet Earth at landing zone 1 down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We're standing by for the call of second stage engine cutoff to place the OneWeb satellites into a parking orbit.
MVAC shutdown.
And there is second stage engine cutoff right on time. Nine minutes into the mission, we've heard now the confirmation of the second stage has completed its first burn. This is the first of actually 3 burns by the upper stage engine tonight. A second burn will place the OneWeb satellites into a circular orbit for deployment, and then a final third burn by the upper stage will be a deorbit burn to target a reentry, a destructive reentry over the Indian Ocean later this evening.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
The second stage is now passed over the horizon from Cape Canaveral, so it's outside of radio signal from the Cape right now, as expected.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And SpaceX Launch Control has confirmed a nominal orbit insertion, 3 big words there, to confirm the Falcon 9 so far this evening has performed as expected to place these satellites into the parking orbit. The rocket is currently at an altitude of 181 kilometers. That's about 120 miles or so above the Earth. Again, another burn by the upper stage is scheduled in 45 minutes. That'll be a very short burn to set up for payload separation. Now, approaching the 13-minute mark in tonight's mission, on the right is a map provided by SpaceX showing the location of the second stage. It's just passing near the west coast of South America over, looks like over the region of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, heading out over the Pacific Ocean in a few moments at orbital velocity. It will fly over Antarctica and then head northbound over the Indian Ocean. And then at that point, at T plus 55 minutes, we expect to see the reignition of the Merlin vacuum engine for a 3-second burn. That's all that's needed from this powerful upper stage engine to nudge the satellites into a more circular, roughly 373-mile or 600-kilometer orbit. And that's the target orbit for the separation of these 40 satellites. These 40 satellites will separate in 3 batches. First batch of 14 will deploy from the dispenser at T plus 58 minutes. About 15 minutes later will be the deployment of 13 more satellites, and then another 15 minutes later we'll see the separation of the final 13 OneWeb satellites from the dispenser on the Falcon 9's upper stage. We're going to stay live throughout the flight sequence tonight to show these satellites being deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. Technology permitting, we'll see exactly where the deployments occur in relation to ground stations. Whether we'll see live video during all these deployments, we're not sure at this point, but we hope to get some video of the upcoming engine burn and the deployment of the OneWeb satellites. If we do get video, we'll bring that to you. The video will be coming from SpaceX, and we'll bring that to you. It could be an interesting sight to see 14, then 13, and then 13 more satellites deploy all at once from the Falcon 9.
Acquisition of signal, South Chile.
Now 22 minutes, 45 seconds into the flight. We want to thank those of you who have donated and contributed to us in the Super Chat here on our YouTube channel. That's one way to help us maintain and continue our launch coverage here at Kennedy Space Center and around the world. You can also become a member of our YouTube channel. Click the join button. You'll gain access to exclusive members-only video features that we have just for you. Depending on which level you select, which tier you select, you can gain access to those video features, as well as you'll be supporting our coverage. Again, that's another way to do that. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that for free. You'll get a notice every time we're going live with coverage. You'll never miss any one of our live coverage events if you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Here's a view of the full moon rising here at Kennedy Space Center, reflected in the term basin. A nearly full moon, I should say, rising, with pad 39A in the center of the frame, the moon off to the right. Right now, NASA's Artemis 1 mission is on the way back from the moon. NASA's Orion spacecraft is scheduled to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and splash down on Sunday in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Baja California, concluding a 25-and-a-half-day test flight. So far, a highly successful demonstration mission for the Space Launch System moon rocket and the Orion crew capsule. This is an unpiloted test before astronauts fly on Artemis 2 around the moon, and in subsequent Artemis flights will be attempting landings on the lunar surface. 50 years ago last night, the Apollo 17 mission lifted off from pad 39A, this very same launch facility at Kennedy Space Center. That was the final Apollo mission to the moon. Again, that anniversary 50 years ago last night, the only night launch of NASA's Saturn V moon rocket. We didn't have to wait to the end of the program for the first Space Launch System launch at night. That was the first flight that occurred at 1:47 a.m. Eastern Time on November the 16th to begin the Artemis 1 mission. Also notable, with the moon rising heading into that cloud bank, the next Falcon 9 launch from here on Florida Space Coast is scheduled for no earlier than Sunday, with a commercial lunar lander developed by a Japanese company called iSpace. That lander is called Hakuto R and is carrying a lunar rover, a small lunar rover for the United Arab Emirates. That mission is also carrying a CubeSat called Lunar Flashlight for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Again, that launch is the next on the runway here at Kennedy, actually down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Another Falcon 9 rocket being prepared to launch that mission on Sunday morning around 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time. The Hakuto R lunar lander is scheduled to make its landing attempt on the near side of the moon in late April.
Expected loss of signal, Punta Arenas.
We're hearing some periodic callouts from SpaceX Launch Control on the Falcon 9's status. It's currently in a parking orbit or a transfer orbit, flying over Antarctica now. It's just passed outside the range of a ground station in Punta Arenas, Chile. It'll be flying over Antarctica and then heading northbound over the Indian Ocean, now 24 minutes away from the second burn on tonight's mission.
Acquisition of signal, control.
The ground station in Troll, Antarctica, now receiving signals from the Falcon 9. while we wait for the next engine burn by the upper stage, which is about 23 minutes away. I'll be happy to take some questions from our audience. If you have any questions about this launch or any other news in the space industry, please go ahead and submit that in our chat, and I'll do my best to answer those. First up, a question from Heather Maxfield asking if the second stage from today's launch was expended, or are they sending out a recovery ship? The upper stage for Falcon 9 missions is never recovered. SpaceX is developing the next generation Starship rocket, which will be a fully reusable system with recovery of the first stage and second stage. But the Falcon 9 rocket, the only major element of it that's not reusable is the second stage. So we saw the first stage booster return to landing at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. That was recovered and will be refurbished and reused. Also, a SpaceX recovery boat was positioned down in the Straits of Florida between South Florida and Cuba to retrieve the payload fairing halves from the ocean. They will parachute into the sea for recovery, and that boat will return to Port Canaveral, and technicians will refurbish those payload fairing shells for reuse. The second stage, after releasing the 40 OneWeb satellites, will actually perform a final deorbit burn with its engine to target a destructive reentry over the Indian Ocean. Most of that upper stage will burn up during atmospheric reentry, and that deorbit burn is a measure to minimize the risk of creating space junk and leaving that upper stage in orbit as a piece of space debris. So SpaceX, like many launch companies, will direct that upper stage to do a deorbit burn for a destructive reentry.
Expected loss of signal, troll.
We've now added a clock on the upper right. The clock counting up is the mission elapsed time since liftoff of the Falcon 9, and the clock just inside of 20 minutes and counting down is the time remaining until the first batch of OneWeb satellites will separate from the Falcon 9. Again, there will be 3 deployment events. 14 satellites will separate, and then a 15-minute break. 13 more satellites will separate, and then another 15-minute gap, and then the final separation event, will be at 1 hour 29 minutes with another 13 satellites deploying from the dispenser. And we want to thank Panama Floyd for the suggestion to add the countdown clock for payload deployment. We've done that, and thank you to Panama Floyd for their donation as well. Again, while we wait for the next event, which is about 15 minutes away, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat. Any questions about this mission or any other news in the space industry or the space program, I'll be happy to try to answer. It's a nice view of the full moon, nearly full moon, shining bright over the eastern horizon from our camera position here at the Kennedy Space Center at the press site, with pad 39A off to the lower left of the moon, where the Falcon 9 rocket took off 41 minutes ago. Also visible here, the flashing aviation hazard lights at the top of the Starship launch tower. That launch pad for the Super Heavy and Starship rocket is now under construction at pad 39A. Mac Goodman asks, is there a tentative schedule for January? Right now we don't have a lot of confirmed launch dates for January, but there are launches scheduled for January. One of those includes the next Falcon Heavy rocket, which is carrying a U.S. Space Force payload that will launch from this very same pad 39A here at Kennedy Space Center. That is currently targeted for early to mid-January. There are also multiple Falcon 9 rockets scheduled for January for launch here at Florida Space Coast, including a mission with the GPS navigation satellite, multiple missions carrying Starlink internet satellites also on the schedule for January here in Florida, and OneWeb's next launch with the next batch of 40 OneWeb satellites, very similar to what we saw tonight, is also scheduled for January. And we're talking about January launches. Just to recap what's to come later this month, there are 5 more SpaceX missions currently scheduled through the end of December, 3 from here in Florida, 2 from California. Another great shot of the nearly full moon rising higher in the sky here at Kennedy Space Center. Now about 11 minutes until the next burn by the Falcon 9's upper stage engine. Now 47.5 minutes since launch. Again, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now. I'm at Kennedy Space Center reporting live on the launch of OneWeb Flight 15. Now about 8 minutes remaining until the restart of the second stage engine, and then we're about 10.5 minutes until the first set of OneWeb satellites deploy. And if you have questions relating to this mission or the space program or space industry in general, please submit that in the chat. I'll try to answer. Another question from John Payne. So when do we plan on putting a man on the moon again? So the Artemis program that I've talked about a little bit tonight is NASA's effort to do just that. The Artemis 1 mission, an unpiloted, uncrewed test flight, is on the way back from the moon right now as we speak, targeting a splashdown in the Pacific on Sunday. Artemis 2 is the next mission for the Space Launch System moon rocket and the Orion spacecraft. That's scheduled for late 2024 with a crew of 4. Will actually be 3 NASA astronauts and 1 Canadian astronaut who haven't been assigned to that flight yet, although we expect to hear that assignment in the coming months. That mission will last less than 10 days. We'll do a loop around the far side of the moon, much like the trajectory that was followed by the Apollo 13 mission back in 1970. And then NASA's plan after that is for Artemis 3. That'll be the first lunar landing attempt. NASA says that is scheduled for no earlier than 2025. However, NASA's Inspector General has reported it's not likely to occur before 2026 and could happen even later. There are several constraints to that schedule. One of them is the development of new lunar spacesuits. Another is the development and certification of a commercial moon lander. SpaceX is under contract with NASA to provide a variant of their Starship rocket to fly uncrewed to the moon, to lunar orbit, and then the Orion spacecraft, launched on the Space Launch System from here at Kennedy Space Center, will rendezvous with the astronauts on board and dock with the Starship, and then the crew members, at least 2 of them, would float into the Starship and make a descent toward the lunar South Pole. So no earlier than 2025, more likely to happen later in the decade for the Artemis 3 mission, for the next lunar lander mission with humans on board, and the first lunar landing attempt for the Artemis program. NASA hopes after that to fly a cadence of 1 lunar landing mission per year, although that schedule is also in some doubt because NASA needs to build a new mobile launch tower for the next version of the Space Launch System, which will debut on the Artemis 4 mission. That mobile launch tower already is suffering some delays. Here's a view now of the Artemis 1 mobile launch tower that's actually configured for what's known as Block 1 of the Space Launch System. That's the variant of the SLS moon rocket that launched on Artemis 1. The same version will fly on Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. And NASA and Boeing are developing a larger upper stage to debut on Artemis 4. That upper stage requires a new mobile launch tower, which has to be built. And it's not clear right now when that launch tower will be ready for Artemis 4 and following missions. Another question, will we be covering the Orion splashdown on Sunday? Yes, we will be covering that on spaceflightnow.com, our website, providing live coverage there.
Acquisition of signal, Maldives.
SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is now in range of a ground station in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Now about a minute away from the restart of the Merlin vacuum engine. This burn will last just 3 seconds. That's all that's needed with this Merlin vacuum engine because it is a powerful engine by upper stage standards, more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. So it just needs 3 seconds of an impulse to circularize the rocket's orbit, bringing the perigee or low point of the orbit from below 200 kilometers up to about 600 kilometers.
MVAC startup. And shutdown.
We've heard verbal confirmation from SpaceX's launch control team that the restart, the 3-second burn, has been completed on the second stage.
Nominal orbit insertion.
There's the call from SpaceX launch control. Nominal orbit insertion, so the Falcon 9 has achieved the expected altitude and inclination for the deployment of 40 OneWeb satellites. The first of those deployment events is scheduled in 2.5 minutes. 14 of the 40 satellites will be separated at once from the Falcon 9. Now 30 seconds from the expected deployment of the first 14 of 40 OneWeb Internet satellites on tonight's mission. We're not getting any live video from the rocket at this point, so we may not see this first separation event live.
Acquisition of signal, Bangalore.
We did see a brief glimpse of video from the upper stage provided by
OneWeb,
SpaceX.
Sat A1 and A5, separation confirmed. OneWeb, Sat A4 and A8, separation confirmed.
We are hearing callouts now as SpaceX confirms the different separation events. We've heard confirmation so far of 4 OneWeb satellites having been deployed from the dispenser on the upper stage.
OneWeb, Sat B1 and B5, separation confirmed. OneWeb, Sat C1 and C5, separation confirmed. OneWeb, Sat A2 and A6, separation confirmed.
We are seeing some intermittent views from the rocket, showing the stack of OneWeb satellites on the vehicle as the deployment sequence continues. There's a good shot, one of the satellites briefly there on the dispenser.
OneWeb, Sat B4 and B8, separation confirmed.
Expected loss of signal, Maldives.
OneWeb, Sat A3 and A7, separation confirmed.
Now 1 hour 4 minutes 47 seconds into the flight. I believe that's all 14 satellites in this first group have deployed. They separated from the dispenser in pairs of 2 over the course of about 6 minutes or so. There will now be a 8-minute break until the next batch of 13 satellites begins separating from the Falcon 9 dispenser. The upper stage will fire its reaction control system thrusters to separate from the satellites that were just deployed, to give some physical separation from those satellites before resuming the deployment sequence at 1 hour and 13 minutes.
Expected loss of signal, Bangalore.
Falcon 9 is just passed out of the range of a downrange tracking station in Bangalore, India. Currently passing north. It's just passed over the Himalayas, now over China. And it'll be heading over the North Pole in the next few minutes. 5 minutes remaining until the next set of OneWeb satellites begins deploying from the dispenser on the Falcon 9. Continuing to see beautiful views of the nearly full moon over Kennedy Space Center. We saw the moon rise just a few minutes after the Falcon 9 took off from pad 39A. Now about 2.5 minutes until the next deployment sequence gets underway in space for the next set of 13 OneWeb satellites. These satellites each weigh about 325 pounds or 147 kilograms. Again, there were 40 satellites on this rocket when it launched at 5:27 p.m. 14 of those have been confirmed deployed. Another 13 will be deployed beginning in about 2 minutes, and then the final deployment sequence will be at 1 hour and 29 minutes into the flight for another 13 satellites. This picture comes from OneWeb, was captured inside the payload processing facility here at Cape Canaveral before SpaceX encapsulated the stack of satellites inside their payload fairing. The satellites were manufactured by a company called OneWeb Satellites, which is a joint venture between Airbus and the company OneWeb, which operates the network. And after separating from the rocket, the satellites will extend their solar panels and activate their xenon-fueled plasma engines to raise their orbit from 600 kilometers up to about 1,200 kilometers, where they will join the rest of the network, rest of the fleet. And with these 40 satellites, OneWeb will have launched 504 satellites of a planned network of nearly 650 spacecraft to provide global, low-latency, high-speed broadband internet service to consumers and clients such as rural communities, ships, airplanes, schools, hospitals, businesses. The OneWeb network is geared toward providing internet service to enterprise customers, whereas SpaceX's Starlink internet network is tailored for consumer-grade broadband for individuals. These satellites, built by OneWeb Satellites, were manufactured again just outside the gate of Kennedy Space Center. This is their first launch from here in Florida, so it allowed some of the satellite teams to watch their satellites actually launch. The previous missions have gone up from places like Kazakhstan, Russia, French Guiana, and India. We've now passed the point of the expected resumption of the payload deployment sequence on board the Falcon 9, but right now the rocket is outside of communications range with any ground stations, so these deployments, as they're happening right now, are not being covered live by SpaceX due to a lack of ground station coverage. Ground station coverage should be picked up soon, perhaps at a ground station at Svalbard Island in the Arctic Ocean. That will be the next possible ground station that could pick up signals from the rocket. That'll be followed by a flight over Canada and then the United States, where there are multiple ground stations available for SpaceX to receive signals from the rocket.
7 OneWeb spacecraft separations confirmed.
It appears the Falcon 9 has passed back within range of a ground station, and SpaceX has just confirmed
OneWeb sat D4 and D8 separation confirmed.
they confirmed 7 separation events and then 2 more, so that's 9 more if I'm counting correctly, for a total of 23 of 40 OneWeb satellites deployed so far in this separation sequence.
OneWeb sat D3 and D7 separation confirmed.
That should be 25 satellites deployed now. Now we're seeing a live view from the Falcon 9 showing the remaining 15 satellites. There's another separation event there, the first one we've seen live. One of the OneWeb satellites flying free of the dispenser, 611 kilometers over the Arctic.
OneWeb sat C2 and C6 separation confirmed.
There's a great view of another of the OneWeb satellites separating. Each of these satellites is about the size of a mini refrigerator, a dorm room fridge, so to speak. Again, 325 pounds, 147 kilograms in mass. These are somewhat smaller than SpaceX's Starlink internet satellites. But OneWeb's network and business case actually only requires just shy of 650 satellites for a fully operational network. SpaceX has now launched more than 3,500 satellites for the Starlink network. With these 40 satellites launched today, OneWeb will surpass 500 satellites launched, 504 to be exact, on 15 different rockets, 13 Soyuz missions, 1 on an Indian GSLV Mark III vehicle, and then now 1 on a Falcon 9 rocket. So with that, 27 of the satellites have deployed, 13 to go, and we're now 6.5 minutes until the final batch of 13 satellites begin separating from the dispenser. This dispenser is a metallic structure that was designed and developed by SpaceX in just a couple of months' time. OneWeb previously used a dispenser developed by the company Beyond Gravity, formerly known as Ruag Space in Sweden. That dispenser was a carbon fiber structure and was tailored for launches on Russia's Soyuz rocket, which has a smaller payload fairing. That dispenser could accommodate 36 satellites in one go. This SpaceX dispenser can hold 40 OneWeb satellites on a single rocket. Again, OneWeb had to suspend their launch campaign earlier this year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Western governments levied sanctions on the Russian government after the invasion of Ukraine. And in response to that, in a tit-for-tat, the Russian government made demands to OneWeb that included the divestiture of the UK government's stake in the company. The UK government and OneWeb refused that, and with that decision, Russia suspended their launches for OneWeb using Soyuz rockets and actually have custody of more than 30 OneWeb satellites that were at the Baikonur Cosmodrome or waiting a launch back in March when all this happened. OneWeb does not expect to get those satellites back, but OneWeb has built additional satellites to make up for that. They've taken a charge of more than $200 million due to that suspension of launch operations. And within a few weeks, OneWeb had signed contracts with SpaceX and with New Space India Limited, the commercial arm of the Indian Space Agency, for 5 more launches, 3 on Falcon 9 rockets, 2 on Indian rockets, to largely complete the deployment of the network, taking the place of 6 Soyuz launches that were still pending from Russia. OneWeb has since confirmed they actually plan a 6th mission, a 4th launch on a Falcon 9 rocket to carry additional OneWeb satellites into space next year. That's going to be a rideshare launch with Iridium. So after this mission, OneWeb has 4 more flights planned to complete their first generation network. 3 of those on Falcon 9 rockets from the US and 1 on an Indian rocket early next year. As you can see in this tracking map provided by SpaceX, the Falcon 9 upper stage with the remaining satellites for OneWeb on board has passed over the North Pole region, over the Arctic Ocean, is now approaching northern Canada, heading south once more over Canada, and then it'll be flying over the United States. 2 minutes and 40 seconds until the final sequence of spacecraft deployment events gets underway.
Expected loss of signal is forward. Acquisition of signal, Kodiak.
And a downrange tracking station at Kodiak Island, Alaska, is now receiving signals from the Falcon 9. Less than a minute until the payload deployments resume. We've now arrived at the expected time of the third payload deployment sequence. And with the rocket back in range of a ground station in Alaska, we're now seeing video from the second stage of the Falcon 9.
OneWeb, Sat E3 and E7, separation confirmed.
And we're hearing calls from SpaceX Launch Control to confirm that the OneWeb satellites have resumed deploying. The first two in this final batch have separated. 11 to go. The video from the onboard camera, as you might expect, being relayed from space through a remote ground station and then back to SpaceX, is coming with a bit of lag, so we're hearing some confirmation of these events verbally from members of the launch team before we see the evidence of it visually from the onboard camera.
OneWeb, Sat B3, separation confirmed.
Expected loss of signal, Kodiak.
And the tracking station on Kodiak Island, Alaska, has lost the signal from the rocket as it flies over the horizon as expected.
OneWeb, Sat D1 and D5, separation confirmed.
2 more satellites have deployed. 7 to go.
OneWeb, Sat E8, separation confirmed.
1 more satellite.
OneWeb, Sat E4, separation confirmed.
2 more satellites away from the dispenser. We'll stand by for the final few OneWeb satellites to deploy from the Falcon 9.
Acquisition of signal, Vandenberg.
Video we're seeing now is being downlinked through a ground station at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California.
OneWeb, Sat D2 and D6 separation confirmed. OneWeb, Sat E2 and E6 separation confirmed.
Two more satellites have deployed.
OneWeb, Sat E1 and E5 separation confirmed. 40 OneWeb spacecraft satellite separations confirmed.
And there's the verbal call out. Two more satellites have deployed. You're seeing one of them separating now, the other on the opposite side in the lower left. If you look closely, you can see it separating from the dispenser. So with that, all 40 OneWeb satellites have been deployed by SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket in polar orbit. So a successful launch this evening from Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX's first mission for OneWeb is now in the books. The second stage in the next few minutes will perform a deorbit burn, or reignite its main engine for a few seconds to drop its orbit back into the atmosphere. It'll burn up over the Indian Ocean for disposal. And the OneWeb satellites will be extending their solar panels and antennas. They'll radio their status to OneWeb control centers in Washington, D.C. and in London, where engineers are on station to oversee the initial activation of each satellite with the help of automated software. And then the satellites will raise their orbits using plasma propulsion systems from their current altitude of about 600 kilometers up to their operating altitude of 1,200 kilometers. That'll take a few months, and then they'll enter service providing global broadband internet network connectivity for OneWeb and OneWeb's customers. This was the 55th SpaceX launch of the year. There are 5 more SpaceX missions currently on the books for this year. Looking ahead, the next mission that we'll be covering live, the next launch we'll be streaming live, is scheduled for no earlier than Sunday at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station here in Florida, from Pad 40. That is the delayed launch of a Falcon 9 rocket with the commercial moon lander called Hakuto-R from the Japanese company iSpace. So that's an early morning launch Sunday from here in Florida. That mission will also include a landing of the first stage booster back here in Florida at Cape Canaveral, much like we saw this evening. Following that, Rocket Lab's first launch from Wallops Island, Virginia, their first launch from U.S. soil, is scheduled for December the 13th. That is Tuesday evening, carrying satellites, a cluster of small satellites into orbit for the company Hawkeye 360. These satellites are part of a signals intelligence network or fleet being developed by Hawkeye. Again, that's the first launch of Rocket Lab's small electron launcher from U.S. soil. That was delayed from this week due to some weather issues up at the Wallops Island launch site. The same day, on December the 13th, the third to last launch of an Ariane 5 rocket is scheduled from the Guiana Space Center in Kourou, French Guiana. That will carry 3 satellites into geostationary transfer orbit. 2 of those, Galaxy 35 and 36, are from Intelsat. This continues the deployment of Intelsat C-band TV broadcasting satellites to cover the United States. These are similar to some Galaxy satellites from Intelsat that were launched by SpaceX earlier in the fall. The third satellite on that mission is a European weather satellite, the first in a new generation of geostationary weather satellites called MTG-I-1 to cover Europe and Africa. And then on December the 15th, SpaceX will be in action at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with the launch of the SWAT satellite. This is a ocean topography mission developed in partnership between NASA and the French Space Agency. So the SWAT satellite, SWOT, is scheduled for launch on December the 15th from California. And again, the first stage booster on that flight will return to the Landing Zone 4 pad at Vandenberg for landing. So 3 consecutive Falcon 9 launches this month, tonight, Sunday, and December the 15th from California, will all feature return to launch site landings for the first stage booster. So these are the launches we'll be covering over the next week or so. We'll be covering the Artemis 1 mission as well. We've been streaming views of the Artemis 1 mobile launch platform and tower as it moved off pad 39B today. It's now parked outside the vehicle assembly building. It'll move into the high bay there tomorrow for some repairs and inspections and some refurbishment. And then it'll be upgraded with a new crew escape system over the next few months in preparation for the Artemis 2 mission, the first Artemis mission with astronauts in 2024. We'll also be covering the splashdown of the Artemis 1 Orion capsule out in the Pacific Ocean on Sunday. We'll leave you with one last look of pad 39A here in Florida, where the Falcon 9 took off at 5:27 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:27 UTC, and successfully delivered 40 OneWeb Internet satellites into polar orbit. If you want to support our coverage, please consider becoming a member. You can join our YouTube channel by just hitting the join button, and depending on which level or membership tier you choose, you can gain access to exclusive members-only video features, and you'll be supporting our coverage when you do that. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We'll see you next time.